Hello, friends and adventurers. Traps, cool and unusual, for your dungeon delving, tabletop role-playing pleasure and experience. Welcome to the DM table. I'm M, and indeed, this is another episode of Traps, where I give you some 5, usually, traps to place in your dungeons, and for your players to enjoy. But these might not be necessarily for every table, so check out my tutorial on how to make even the most lethal, crazy, devious, impeccable traps be fun for your players, so that they don't just quit. Anyways, in today's traps, let's start with number 1, running chest. Now, anybody who's familiar with playing Diablo-like games is familiar with the situation where you overextend and go too deep a little bit, and then you get surrounded by enemies and then you die. So, this running chest trap is simply an animated object, a chest in this case, which as soon as your players enter the room, it runs away. It just runs away to the next room, turns the corner and escapes. And it may or may not look glitzy and full of treasure and so on, as much as its framework and meticulous workmanship allows. Well, that also alluring chest is now running, so players might just run for it to catch the chest, even if the room has enemies, but more so, especially if the room is empty or has few other chests which are of more mundane design. But of course, these mundane chests may actually have treasure, whilst this running chest is probably a trap and might not even have any treasure inside, even if it's richly decorated. So now this chest runs into the next room, and in the next room it sits down, places itself right near the next exit, and as the players run in, they see the chest, they start fighting whatever's in the room, maybe fall into some other traps, but as soon as they step fully into the room, the chest picks up and runs away again. Now, the players may stay and fight, or they may run after the chest. If they run after the chest a few times, this may not bode well for them. If they stay and fight, they'll still be irritated and they'll want to chase that chest all the harder the next time they meet it, which is in the next room where it placed itself easily by plonking down in the middle near the next exit and so on. A very clever trap from the dungeon makers, and once they discovered that the chest was eventually empty, well, you can see how they could be annoyed for getting tricked so easily. Once again, if you want to make these traps appealing to your players, even if they are irritating, and make this into a sort of almost like a friendly competition between the players and the enemies and duel of wits, check out the tutorial that explains the mindset behind DMing these sort of dungeons. But to not be boring, let's continue. At number 2, we have almost an extension of this, a tight treasury. Now this tight treasury, it's a treasure room in a dungeon where you can get into by crawling through some, well, short enough but tight enough crawl space. Let's say that there was a wall safe that actually led into this, as in the door of the safe are not actually door to the safe, they are door to the crawl space, and they lead into the actual bigger treasury, which is a whole room. So when players discover that there is a secret treasury room behind the safe, they'll be overjoyed. But this is a tight crawl space, so somebody needs to crawl inside at first. Now, others may follow, but as soon as first person touches ground inside the room, now all this wonderful treasure lining the walls and the floor of the room, you know, series of weapons and armor, series of chests and gold pieces, well, most of it is just animated objects, like that previous chest, and the weapons are animated objects that will fight. The armor is animated object that will try to get in the way and tank and maybe wield some animated objects until it doesn't. When it's defeated, the animated object just continues fighting because the armor is just being a distraction. And the chests, well, they bite. They fight and they bite, and the gold pieces scattered around, well, there are some, but all the chests are empty, and all these magical looking weapons with gold decorations and whatnot, all of these are just enchanted to be good enough magical animated objects that need to be broken essentially to beat them anyways. Now this room might actually have a hidden path to an actual treasury afterwards for, people who actually know about this, but persistent and clever players can always beat all these and feel much better and cleverer and more powerful for beating such interesting and varied things. So that's one of the reasons why you want good traps and good adventures in your dungeons, because makes the dungeon more worth it. And speaking of unusual challenges, at number 3 we have rolling barrels, where we have, whether inside the dungeon or somewhere else where there's tight enough space, we have, well, whatever you want. It can be kobolds, it can be whatever you prefer, but the monsters or the defenders will be rolling barrels down a rampy corridor, that goes down towards the party that's trying to ascend. But whilst these barrels in the beginning might be just barrels filled with oil, it doesn't even have to be boiling, and the party might not think anything of it, in anger hacking and slashing at those barrels, opening them up. After a little bit, next barrels are filled with gunpowder or the equivalent, or just with the flammable substance that has a lit fuse, and this fuse is either expertly cut by the malicious expert to detonate at the bottom of the ramp, or they're just an oversized cocktail of fiery fun. So when barrel reaches the party, whether it's hacked and slashed or it exploding on its own, it also lights the corridor on fire. That was thoroughly soaked with gallons and gallons of oil from the previous barrels. Of course, again, this need not be so dangerous if your party tries to avoid to the best of their abilities to overcome the challenge, to kill the defenders up top before they just try to bull rush through the middle, but however they play it, this is an interesting challenge. But what about the opposite situation for these clever adventurers? What about a false trap that's hiding the actual passageway to gold and riches and actual good loot? Well, just use a false pit, or a false Iron Maiden for that matter. You open up the Iron Maiden, it looks normal, but for the rogue that did a good job, or for those in the know, it's like an elevator. You step inside, you press the button, you close it, and voila, the spikes retract and or fold, and the back door opens, leading to the treasury. Now for the false pit, it's simply a pit trap that looks like a normal easy trap that the defenders might pepper the dungeon with, but in actuality it might have a secret door somewhere hidden on the bottom, on the walls, wherever, where people wouldn't usually look unless they fall into the overly easy trap. And mind you, the trap might be bluntly overly easy, where it's not intended to ever be fallen into, which might tip off the smarter players, but if this is early on, most players won't notice, and then maybe they'll find a clue later in the dungeon that they missed such an opportunity, and then they'll think about it in the future dungeons, giving them better opportunities, because you want to teach your players to contend with these things, and yet you want to throw things at them. So teach, then give something to contend with. Teach, then give something to contend with, and so on and so forth, so that your players feel like they're winning, thriving, and learning. And the traps, well, they might just get more vicious, but they are getting more victorious. So That's another method to have your players enjoy, and all these methods should be used so that your traps don't get boring. And finally, at number 5 is something you might have even never used, even though you have seen it and enjoyed it perhaps yourself at a time or another. You see, in video games, especially older, we had platforming challenges. You know, moving platforms, logs falling over a waterfall, whatever those may have been, but imagine how cool these can be as a series of skill checks and how great a scenery you can have in your dungeon. But you don't have to keep it just at acrobatic jumps that would make even a skateboarder envious. No, you can have actual traps that accompany the platforming challenge and maybe even enemies. Now, this one is not meant to get your players so much as to make them feel extremely badass, where they get to do this skill challenge series whilst contending with something more mundane, making them feel like they're in a tremendously wonderful action sequence. So it feels incredibly rewarding just to play the segment of the dungeon, even if it's not connected with specified player reward otherwise. And well, that's another way to enjoy your traps, to make them more glamorous, to make them more worth contending with. So customize all these traps and use them however you want, combining them in most epic manner you can imagine. And adventurer, if you thought this was unique, maybe you can spare me a little click, and I could see you here perhaps next or even every week. I will occasionally make more of these traps, well, each time, because I love making them and they're all gonna be either original or worth mentioning in such a classical manner like these platforming challenges that we mentioned today, or rolling barrels. But whichever reason we pick the traps to enjoy for, they will always be cool and unusual, so pop by next time. And if you have any questions, do ask them in the comments, because I would love to talk to you all. See you next time. Bye.